Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'm Courtney Ray, I'm BARC's Associate Director, and presenting with me tonight will be Brenna Bell, our staff attorney, and we also have a handful of other BARC staff on the call. We're gonna have two kind of segments of the presentation, and we're gonna use the chat for comments because we are packing a lot into this tonight. So if you haven't been on a Zoom call, which I find highly unlikely, you'll see a chat box icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you click that, will allow you to put your comments or questions there. And Daniela will be keeping an eye on that. And you can also use that chat to let us know if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. There are some other features that you'll find there, like to raise your hand or to applause or give a thumbs up. And please go ahead and use all those. It's really great for us to see that interaction. So first, a little bit about BARC. We are based here in Portland, Oregon, working to protect and restore the Mount Hood National Forest, which is, as we all know, part of the public land system here in the United States. And BARC's mission is to transform Mount Hood into a place where natural processes prevail, where wildlife thrives, and where local communities have a social, cultural, and economic investment in its restoration and preservation. We've been doing this work for about 20 years, since 1999, yeah. And we are volunteer-driven, volunteer-powered, and so we really encourage you to stay involved with BARC if this is your first event. Keep track of us on Facebook and our website. You can sign up for our emails. We have events that as soon as we get into a COVID-safe situation, we'll be doing more events in the forest, and we have a lot of events online right now. So without further ado, I will get into our presentation. You're going to lose me on video just because that's how technology wants it to be tonight, but I'll be here. So the first part of our presentation tonight is actually a practice that we want to engage you all in. As an organization founded by white people in a settler colonial environmentalist lineage, BARC understands that our work has been inherently within and empowered by a white supremacist legacy of land theft and the erasure of Native authority over the stolen lands, which are now referred to as public lands in Mount Hood National Forest. So as an advocacy organization, BARC is maintaining relationships with agencies of the federal government, which is the original implementer of the violence in land theft, colonization, and displacement of Indigenous people, including through the creation of public lands itself. And these actions have not been corrected. So non-Native people today have a privilege to access this land as a direct result of this legacy of violence and injustice. BARC's current staff, board of directors, and volunteers are working to transform our organization. And first of all, by acknowledging all of our implicit participation in the ongoing displacement of Native people from these lands, whenever we claim the benefits of this inherent legacy and these unearned privileges. So I would like to invite you all to do a little bit of work of placing yourself, your individual person and your family history, and where you are today in this very moment, in this context that BARC is working to acknowledge, and not just to pay lip service to, but to bring that into practice in our daily lives. So we want to practice acknowledgement and respect as individuals and in our personal work by dedicating time, energy, and action to support the communities of Indigenous people who have always lived here, who continue to live here. And there are many, many Native nations. To name a few, the Multnomah, Molalla, Kalapuya, Chinook, Clackamas, Wasco, Wishram, Northern Paiute. Those are nations who we know spend time in the area that we are now occupying. And as the Pacific Northwest, in a more larger regional way, has been a crossroads for thousands and thousands of years, we also know that people from far away across the continent and even on the South American continent have also called this place home prior to us being here. And so, again, with this context in mind and thinking about yourself, your experience, your family, your history, your education, your privilege, where you work, where you live, and how you act and behave on these lands. We're going to do this practice of setting some intention and an action plan for yourself. So I'll just take a minute or two and stop talking and give everyone a chance, please grab a notebook, or you can write this on your notes on your phone or wherever. If you've been at BARC events in the past, you should have a journal of this work. And I want you to go to that and look at, how have you been committing to the actions you thought of and written down in the past, and reflect on that and update your action plan. And if this is your first time, maybe you want to think about places you want to learn about or actions you want to take to start out. And so we'll have 2 minutes for that starting right now. So thanks everybody for participating in that. Now I would like to respectfully invite any Native people who are with us tonight to speak to this issue. If you would like to, the floor is yours. And you can just unmute yourself and speak, or if you would prefer to put something in the chat, that's fine. This space is for you. So for the last piece of this practice, I would like everyone to kind of turn their attention away from themselves and to think more specifically about generating a sense of respect and contemplation and humility in honor of the original people who are here tonight and who are across this continent and this world in the past, present, and future. I hope that gave some space for you to let some things come up that can inform you about your place in this work as your individual story fits into this. And thank you all for supporting this important practice and this learning. And we really encourage that you continue not only to make statements of acknowledgement, but to practice that through action in all areas of your life. And you'll see that here at BARC, and we hope that you'll do that with us and that you'll take this practice into other spaces, wherever you may be, whatever you may be doing. So tonight, we will be discussing the larger historical context that our land acknowledgement is in. And this will be part of a series. We have realized that we can't fit it all into one workshop. So for today, we will focus on the Doctrine of Discovery, early American settler identity, manifest destiny in the treaty period of the mid-1800s, particularly in Oregon. Part 2 will be on April 22nd. Moving forward in time then toward the late 19th and early 20th century, where the American preservation and conservation movements kind of emerge, and then the assimilation, allotment, and termination periods of US Indian policy that kind of align with that environmental work. And then the third part, which we haven't a date scheduled yet, is going to be more broadly the 20th century Indian policy, and then the settler colonial public land management, more like how it is that we see today, with the really modern examples of that in the self-determination movement that the Native community is certainly like having resurgence or a re-emergence of that. So mark your calendar for the 22nd and stay in touch on that third one. Grab your notebook. There's going to be a lot of information. There's going to be a lot of things you're going to want to look up later. There's going to be just so much that we'll just be kind of throwing out and hoping that we make enough of an impression to pique your interest and get your commitment to continue that learning. But having a notebook handy is going to be helpful. And here we go. I need to move some things around on my screen so I can see better. All right, so we're going to start with what is known as the Doctrine of Discovery. Go ahead and hit the little clap hands or something if you learned about this in school. It's the kind of one of the original international laws. So a law that kind of defines the way that different nations will behave toward each other, the conduct between nations. And the Doctrine of Discovery was developed to benefit European Christian countries and to exploit non-Christian, non-European peoples. And this was a legal kind of make-believe that it was thought it justified the European invasion and conquest of other people around the world. And it also reduced the amount of warfare between the European nations, since they had this like first to discover. If you get dibs on a place, and like other European nations will kind of like back off and respect that place. And so we can see that attitude, I think, still happens in American culture, even in the games that little kids play, about this claiming like firstness. Where did the doctrine of discovery come from? It came from the Pope. Pope Alexander VI, I want to say, I think that's right, issued these, they're called Papal Bulls. And they're there at the bottom. You can write those down and look those up later. Basically, edicts, Christian laws that the Pope issued that gave all the Christian European monarchies directions to go out and conquer and convert and claim the lands and resources for Europe and for the Christian Europe. And it also gave them kind of legal permission to subdue and subject any non-Christian people to their rule and their authority. So again, these are quote unquote laws that just got made. And then the European nations proceeded to go around the world showing up and saying, hey, we have the right to do this to you because we have a doctrine of discovery, and it gives us these rights and powers of discovery. So the colonies assumed, the European colonies on this continent, they assumed that they also had the powers and the rights of discovery, since it was, their king who gave them the instructions to come and do and colonize, and that king had been given instructions from the Pope to go and colonize. And so the European colonists came with that idea in mind, and they were in effect, putting that into effect throughout all of their colonial infrastructure as they were engaging with Native people, and then the United States as well, kind of as the great grandkid of the doctrine of discovery, continues to iterate this kind of supremacist, European Christian supremacist policy. Many Indigenous scholars, activists, leaders have broken down and elaborated on the ways that the doctrine of discovery has really skewed the arc of history against Indigenous people around the world, and all the ways that the laws in the United States and in every country that was colonized by a European nation, they have been designed to really uphold this completely made up idea that Christian Europeans are superior to everyone else. So there are plenty of speeches and books and essays and debates, college courses, all kinds of stuff. There's memes, there's GIFs, there's songs, there's movies. This knowledge is not hidden. It's something that's certainly been, there are attempts to expose have been made, but to this day, we're still operating under the principles of discovery. This idea of discovery, it's just going to disappear. Okay, well, that was an image of, a bunch of kind of colonial white men sitting at a desk, and then a group of Indigenous people standing there, like they're doing some kind of, they're making some decision, or they're doing some agreement. There's some papers on the desk in between them. And what I was getting at there is that this idea of discovery, it doesn't just mean like we were here first. It comes with a lot of legal powers that over the several centuries, first the colonial governments, and then the American government kind of teased out all the different ways that they could apply the rights and the powers of discovery. So it started, though, with the idea of ownership, that only European Christians in their superior cultural position were like authorized to own, to really own, to have a title and to have control of the way that lands are transferred. And that the inferior cultures of the world, they could occupy the land. They had a right to like live there and maybe be physically present on it, but they wouldn't have any legal control. They just like by being an inferior type of people, they shouldn't be like qualified to have ownership. And so that in effect just means that all Native people become tenants, and the Europeans are automatically the landlords just as soon as they show up somewhere. And so discovery, when we say this word, we're not just talking about appearing, like finding a place you've never seen before. We're actually talking about a bunch of legal tools that start showing up and getting implemented, that are all kind of captured in the word discovery. So in America, after the revolution, America is not a European country. They're their own new country. They're not in Europe. And so they need to kind of reapply the principles of discovery in order to have the same legal like toolbox that the Europeans had. And so the way this shows up in a big way, the first big way it shows up is in a series of court rulings called the Marshall Trilogy. So John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the United States in the turn of the century in 1800s. And in 1823, and then these other two cases came within 10 years. There are these three cases that really established the way that the United States court system was going to uphold America as a nation that has discovery powers, the way that the European nations believed they had them. And it also sets up the kind of premises on which all the future native or laws relating to the interaction between the United States and the native nations were going to go. These three laws, just briefly, and you should also write these down and look them up. The first ruling, Johnson v. Macintosh, just reestablished that the United States is just as good as a European nation, so we can have ownership the way that a European nation could, and the native people are reduced to occupants. In a nutshell, that's what Johnson v. Macintosh says. And you can see that that continues to show up in the way that the federal government manages Indian land and manages Indian business, and is like the patron, the paternalistic kind of controller of things, while native people have merely a right to be there. And then there are two rulings related to the Cherokee Nation and the state of Georgia. In the first court case, the Cherokee brought these cases to the Supreme Court against the state of Georgia when Georgia was attempting to take land. In the first case, in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that that the state of Georgia is not the superior government, that only the federal government can have that superiority. And so anything that the state wanted to do would be like ineffectual. The state doesn't have the authority to rule over native people. And this set up that relationship where the United States is seen as this paternalistic, like over government, over a sovereign in like a unique foreign state, but one that doesn't actually have true self-determination because it's like living in the house of America. And that, again, when Brenna starts talking about treaties, you'll see more and more how that principle kind of gets built in to more and more policies and laws. And then in the third case, again, okay, so in the second case, they ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation against the state of Georgia, they ruled against them both, honestly. They didn't rule in favor of the Cherokee or of Georgia. But in the third case, they ruled in favor of the Cherokee because the laws that the state of Georgia had attempted to bring were, I guess, not in good faith. And so this is the place where this idea that when you're interpreting the treaty relationships between the United States and a native nation, you should always interpret it to the benefit of the native people. So that's what the court said. And you may hear people saying time and time again, like the policy of the United States is to interpret any treaties to the benefit of the tribe that they're with. But when you see in practice is that actually isn't upheld in that way, and treaties are often broken. Mostly, the majority of the time, treaties are broken. And there seem to be no consequences for that. Okay, this is my favorite slide, the Pope and Andrew Jackson. This is just to illustrate that these ideas that were written by the Pope in the 1400s were super well understood and upheld by the people who put the American nation together. And in the original Papal Bull, which I don't speak Latin, so I don't know how to pronounce this word here, Dum der Versace, but this is the original powers that were granted by the Pope. You have the power and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate anyone who's an unbeliever and enemy of the Christians, wherever they are, wherever you can find them, no matter what they're doing, and you can reduce them into perpetual servitude. And 400 years later, Andrew Jackson says, we've moved them, we're driving them to extinction, and they're surrounded by us and our superior civilization, which now that we've destroyed their resources, we can doom them to weakness and decay. To me, they're saying the exact same thing. And so just to illustrate that the people who had the legal kind of knowledge and set the United States on the legal course that we still are on, they came from this worldview. This is the way that they believed law should be established. And out of this comes the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which I'm not going to talk too much about. You should look it up. But it was related to the 5 tribes in the southeastern part of the United States who were referred to as the Civilized Tribes because they had in some ways adopted the European culture when it came to different things like farming and stuff. And so those 5 tribes were the Seminole, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Creek. And there was a policy of like negotiating and voluntary removal where the people from those nations who wanted to continue their traditional way of life, they could move, they could agree to move, or they could agree to stay where they were, but they would have to assimilate to American life and culture. And so each of those 5 tribes reacted differently when the government went to apply the Indian Removal Act. The Seminoles started a war. They were not about to do anything that they didn't want to do. Some of the other tribes, some people decided they would leave and try to get away from the white settlers. They thought maybe they'd be better off if they got out of the way of all the white settlers. And there's just a mixed reaction, but it does result in the forced migration that is known as the Trail of Tears. And there's a lot to learn about the way the United States applied this quote unquote voluntary removal that I think you should all spend some time with. So at that time, most white Americans thought the Mississippi River was like the boundary of the nation, because on the other side of the Mississippi River was like France. France had claimed that. France had the discovery right to the territory after that. And there was an idea as well that in the government, amongst some in the government who you would say were sympathetic or something to the native nations, that if they moved and they got out of the way, would be better for them because the settlers were just going to continue to predate on them and ruin their lives and harm them if they didn't leave. But that's not what happened. Obviously, the nation continued to expand to the west. So now I'm going to talk more about how the doctrine of discovery relates to the part of the land that we're in right now. So we all know these folks. We're going back in time a little bit from Jackson. We're going back to 1800 or so when Lewis and Clark expedition, that's Thomas Jefferson's administration. And for some background, Thomas Jefferson was a land acquisition attorney since the colonial days, since before the Revolution. And he had already been negotiating in the 13 colonies the control under the king, under the authority of the king, to control and get access to native land. And so he really knew how to implement all these discovery powers. And so we all know the stories of Lewis and Clark. like these intrepid adventurers. This is for kids. It's a best-selling children's series of Lewis and Clark. These explorers, these scientists, they're just having a great time exploring, and they're on a diplomatic mission. They're making friends with all the native people. They're being naturalists. They're studying the wildlife, and they're mapping out the rivers, and they're just doing all this good work, this good scientific exploratory work. But if we really look at the context of what was happening at that time, we can see that Lewis and Clark were actually on a mission to kind of confirm and validate the United States discovery claims to the land of the Louisiana Purchase that they had just purchased from France. So remember, the thing about discovery is dibs. Like, if you're the first one there, then your discovery powers kick in. But when it comes to the Louisiana Purchase, the United States had not been there. Well, France had been there. And when Thomas Jefferson, well, maybe it was John Quincy Adams, I don't forget which one actually purchased the Louisiana Purchase, they didn't technically purchase the land. They purchased the discovery title. It's like purchasing a deed to a place that you've never been. And so Thomas Jefferson, being a land acquisition expert, he knew that in order for that to hold up and for Spain to not contest the United States claim to this Louisiana territory, they needed to establish a stronger kind of evidence of of the United States being presently physically there. And so Thomas Jefferson gave Lewis and Clark new instructions. They actually had already left, but he gave them new instructions to visit every single tribe and to make a certain speech that described the new political situation, to say to them, the French people who ruled you before, they're out of the picture. America is your, quote, great white father now. And to disperse amongst the people these Jefferson peace medals. So they would give out these medals to all the tribes. And if the tribes had anything that France had given them, they would take it back. So they were literally replacing all the evidence of France with evidence of the United States. And you may have seen these, and I can't honestly, it's called a Lewis brand. And these were found on trees across the Pacific Northwest. So they're out here, creating this paper trail. They're like building the record that will, if the United States gets challenged by Spain or by Britain for the Louisiana territory, they can say, no, look, we've been all over this place. We've dispersed all of this evidence of our dominion. And so just to reframe Lewis and Clark a bit. And at the same time, on the Canadian side, or what is now called Canada, the British were getting really close to the Pacific Northwest. And Thomas Jefferson wanted to make sure that the United States got some flags up on the Columbia River before the British got there, to further kind of cement the claim to discovery. So this is the one painting that I could find that has to do specifically with our region. And just, during this same kind of time period of the Lewis and Clark journey, Captain Biddle, who was sent by Thomas Jefferson, gets out at the mouth of the Columbia River, plants a flag, flips over some soil, nails up a plate, and is like, this is the United States now. And all of that is to try to preempt the British, who are really close, like regional, like geographically, they're just a few hundred miles away, and they may have, in some cases, around Astoria and the mouth of the Columbia in general, there's a lot of places where they were going back and forth. Like the British would come and dig up the American flags and put down British flags, and then the Americans would come back and replace all of their kind of insignia and tchotchke that they left behind, right? So there's still this idea of discovery. It's a really weird law because it's a made up law, but then also you have to have some kind of evidence that you were there. So there would be burying coins and stuff. If you look at what happened in the South Pacific, New Zealand, and places like that, they're just burying coins of British money to claim the spot. But that was the way that the law worked in their mind. So just a little strange thing. All right, so to review, the Doctrine of Discovery It's a religious legal concept that was made up by the Pope and has been institutionalized since the 1400s in all kinds of laws and policies, both in the colonial America and in the United States. It applies not only to land, but to all features of life. It's a cultural dominance as well as a territorial dominance. The land claims in the US are kind of legitimized by all these rituals and tokens, are leaving flags and leaving stuff behind. And the Supreme Court in the 1800s reinforced discovery powers and kind of Americanized them, gave them really specific versions that could be applied in the context of America, which was not a European nation. And then the Doctrine of Discovery forms a basis for all policy regarding the relationship between the USA and Native nations. And we got to keep that in mind as we look at everything right up until the modern era, which we'll get to in that third part of the workshop. And before I leave to Brenna, I just have a couple more things. I'm going to digress briefly here. This is a different issue that I talk about a lot. And I think it's important because it speaks to the cultural identity of America, of your average, your everyday pioneering Americans, not just the Thomas Jeffersons and John Marshalls of the world. But at the same time that this westward expansion and this foreign policy stuff was happening in the nation building, and the settlers were crossing the Mississippi and taking over more and more territory, there was this idealistic American identity that was emerging, post-revolution. Before this, they were colonists. Now they're Americans. Well, what does it mean to be American? And some of the earliest giants of American thinking and literature are these guys here. I've included some of their books, and I'm sure that some of this is familiar to folks on this call. If you were educated in America, if you were educated in the environmentalist tradition, you're familiar with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman. And so were folks like John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. And so these ideas about individualism, about nature being the path to a spiritual enlightenment, these are the ideas that many Americans were kind of adopting as part of their American identity. And this stuff is going to continue to show up really strongly in the preservation and conservation movement. So there's also a lot of artwork that comes in this movement, which I didn't include. I usually do. But if you look for paintings, like oil paintings in particular from the Transcendentalists or the Romantic period, and from the Hudson Valley School, you will find these, what we think are beautiful, beautiful landscapes. So there's these majestic rivers and valleys, and then there's sun beaming down, and there's probably a little tribe of Native people in the corner. Those were all kind of reiterating this idea of what the land means to America and how Americans connect to the land, this new land that they've reached through all their trials and tribulations of colonizing. And that idea, paired with all of the policies that were removing Native people and making way for the settlers, leads to this culminating part of the 1800s in American identity, which is manifest destiny. And it's something that I see it coming up more and more and more in the last few years, about particularly about the West, in our discussions about settler colonialism and white supremacy in the West. So it's really, in my mind, a reiteration of the Doctrine of Discovery. It's just an American version. It didn't come from the Pope, it came from a journalist, but it's really saying very much the same thing. You have a mandate from God because your civilization is superior to go ahead and take over the physical land and territory, and to reap all the benefits of it, and to convert and oppress and subjugate anybody who's of a lesser culture than you are. I threw this in here, the savage as wolf policy. You want to write that down, look that up. That's a weird thing. And so all of this stuff culminating together, it's the way people think about what their life is like here in America. It's the way the quote unquote founding fathers are putting together the regulatory landscape for America to be a nation and to interact with other nations and with Native people. And this is the context, both the kind of ideological and the political context that the treaty period arises from, when the government decides they need to start having documentation of their manifest supremacy over the Native people. And so we were going to do a quick break here. I can take questions. I'll turn my camera back on, and then I'll hand it over to Brenna.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that, Courtney. That was a great, either, both refresher and, I didn't learn a lot of these things in college. It's amazing to me, the more I dig into these issues, the more I realize how little I know of the history and how little I've internalized this history. So I think these moments where we take a break and really think through the threads of time that have brought us to this place are really important. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. All right, so Courtney set us up really well I'm going to get more into the specifics of the actual history of settler colonization in Oregon and the treaties that are still the law of the land today. And it's rough. It's rough history. It's the kind of history that I have to take several moments when I'm doing the research and work to stop and sit with and digest. And I encourage you all to do that after this. I would be surprised if this doesn't bring up feelings for you and, reflections on our place here and, what it is for me as a European American settler descendant to be sitting here in Chinookan and Kalapuya territory right now speaking to you is something that I think we were not taught to reflect on. And it's important that we do so we can bring this history into us. And as Courtney and I were planning this, she said, don't think of it as history, think of it as context for everything that's happening now. And I want I thought that was very wise and want to share that with you as well. These are not things that just happened. They are still happening and they affect everything that is going on right now. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit just broadly about the different types of treaty making that the federal government did, because there were three very distinct approaches to treaties that the government had. And the first, the period from 1774 to 1832, I kind of think as the nation-to-nation treaty period. It is when treaties that the United States government was negotiating with Native tribes very closely resembled the treaty that the new US government itself had negotiated with Britain in the Treaty of Paris to end the American Revolutionary War. It was a time when the government still had some sense of tribes as sovereign nations, and there was a recognition of the parallel sovereignty. It was imperfect for sure, but there was much more of a sense of a peer relationship than what we would see in that second period that Courtney, alluded to, talking about the Marshall Trilogy, which started in 1832, because that was a big change from talking about tribes as sovereign independent nations that the United States government was in contractual treaty relationships with, to this sense of treaties as dependents to the ward or guardians of the ward. It was a big shift that came from those cases, especially Johnson v. Macintosh and the second Georgia versus Cherokee, that recognized that tribes went from being independent nations to dependent domestic tribes. And I haven't done enough research to compare the treaties between those two times, But I definitely know that the time period we're going to be talking about is this time, the second time. And it's very clear from the approach to these treaties and the language of them that they are seen, that the tribes are seen as dependents and not as independent sovereign nations. Now, in 1871, treaty making stopped. The United States Congress passed a law that basically, how to say, not delegitimized, but refused to recognize Indian nations as sovereign and even worthy of making treaties with. So the US government could no longer enter into those types of contractual relationships. So the main treaty making period was between 1774 and 1871. And we are going to position ourselves now in the middle of that and come to Oregon for the Oregon version of this story. And before I get too far in, I just wanted to take a pause because I realized, like, I've been giving BARC trainings for a long time and now webinars for about a year, and I never felt as much personal anxiety as I have in getting ready for this one. And I think some of that was the fact that this is information that I am not as practiced at talking about. I usually talk about federal land policy and I will mention the history, but it's not been the focus. It's always tangential to, and here's how the federal government took the land and here are the laws and things like that. And I realized that we are not taught that this is a history that we should be talking about, that discussing the treaties, discussing manifest destiny and settler colonization is something that there's actually a huge social pressure not to talk about, that the empire benefits from the erasure of this history. And so I bumped into that. I had that question, is it even something that I should be talking about? Should it be an Indigenous person talking about it? And then I realized just asking that question itself plays into that erasure, making it seem like that this is not the history of the settler colonists, that this is not the history of even people who are living here in Oregon now, that this is a story that somehow we shouldn't tell, is part of that erasure. And so I wanted to say this, so if you have any hesitancy around this, as Courtney said, there's a million wonderful resources to educate yourself with. And there's the sense that not telling the story just plays into that erasure. So in some ways, this is very much my story. My ancestors came to Oregon in 1848 and settled on Molalla land, which is now outside of Silverton. But you don't have to be the child of pioneers to have this be your story, because you are here now on stolen land. Even if you're not here in Oregon, somewhere where you are is stolen land, and you can find out whose land it is. And I encourage you to look into that and look into the treaties. So kind of with that as a context, we'll get into a little bit more about the history of treaty making in Oregon. We need to start, though, with settler colonization. And actually, we'll start a little bit before that. We'll start with the tribes that have been here since time immemorial. And as you know, people have been living here, especially in the Willamette Valley and along the Columbia River, for as long as time has been. And they had lifeways supported by abundant food. They hunted, fished, ate salmon, deer, wapato, camas, huckleberry, so many more things. The food was abundant, the people were abundant, the cultures were dense, populated, diverse. And all of that changed very, very rapidly from the beginning 1800s to the middle. In about 1830, disease swept through the tribes, and you may have heard this. It was smallpox and malaria. And within a generation, 80 to 90% of the people in Northwest Oregon were dead. We're living in a pandemic now, right? And it's scary. And it is nothing like it would be to lose 8 or 9 out of every 10 people. That is the context we're looking at. If the tribes would have had the time and the space to rebound, they could have. People do rebound from devastating plagues, but they had neither the time and they were about to lose their space. Because in that time when they were severely weakened from disease, the waves of settler colonists began in earnest. So you remember what Courtney was talking about, manifest destiny and doctrine of discovery. This is really important for the context that we're working with now, because starting in the 1840s, there was the Oregon Territory, which was jointly claimed by Great Britain and the United States. The US government, beyond doctrine of discovery, had no real claim to this land. There had been no treaties signed, there had been no land purchases. But even without any of that, and even with a joint claim from the British government, the US government started giving land away to settlers. They passed what's called the Distribution Preemption Act of 1841 to recognize squatters' rights and allow settlers to claim 160 acres of land in the new territory. And if they resided on that property for 14 months, a claimant could purchase the money from the United States at $1.25 an acre. What right did the United States have to be selling this land? None, outside of the doctrine of discovery. But they also had this convenient theory called the Monroe Doctrine, which we created in 1823, that boiled down essentially to the fact that even as American settlers were illegally claiming land, the United States pledged to protect their claims and property. So starting in 1841, the government started giving away land in the Oregon Territory even before it had any claim outside of discovery to the land. Now in 1843, settlers decided to create their own government in the Willamette Valley, and they drafted a constitution and established a provisional government. Under their new government, settlers could now claim up to 640 acres of land free of charge, though still no treaties had been signed with native tribes, no land purchases had been made. And growth of the settler colony was steady and eventually helped bring about the Oregon Treaty of 1846. Because remember, Great Britain and the United States both were laying claim to Oregon Territory. And it was the Oregon Treaty of 46 which established the borderline at the 49th parallel, that border that we still have with Canada, and gave the United States claim to the territory that includes Washington, Idaho, Oregon, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana. So by 1846, the claim had dwindled down just to the United States, but still, no treaties, no purchases. Oregon Territory was officially formed on August 14th, 1848, right about the same time my ancestors got here. But in that territorial creation, remember those land claims that early settlers were making on their own volition or then under the territorial government were nullified because the territorial government had been made up of both US and British citizens. So here's a problem. There's no legal fiction now to authorize those land claims. And the US government had a deep interest in legitimizing those claims that had already happened. Because by this time, colonization and the Oregon Trail had begun in earnest. So in 1850, the US government, which just assumed it had jurisdiction over this whole land because of the treaty, decided on the strong impulse of Oregon's first federal or congressional representative, his name was Samuel Thurston. He made it his top priority to resolve this land claims issue. He recognized that there was an issue that a bunch of settlers had claimed land, that the United States had been tacitly or actively part of that, but now those claims were nullified. Of course, they were all legal fiction to begin with because there was no right beyond discovery to do so. But Representative Thurston said, well, we have to fix this. We have to create a legal right to this land for the settlers. So they passed the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850. And this recognized past claims that were granted under the provisional government, created the Office of Surveyor General to create new claims, and made land grants to new settlers through the General Land Office. And these land grants were to white males. They were 320 acres to bona fide white settlers, or 640 acres to married couples. And like I said, these were retroactive, and most of the land claims under the Oregon Donation Land Claims Act were applied retroactively to settlers who were here before 1850. Now, Congress recognized before they were going to pass the Donation Land Claims Act that there was still the right of tribal title, that the Willamette Valley, as weakened as the tribes were, the tribes still had the right of occupancy to the land and were still there. So it said, before we're going to pass the Donation Land Claims Act, we need to pass a law to extinguish Indian title and direct our Indian representative to remove tribes and, quote, leave the whole of the most desirable portion open to white settlers. So that's what happened next. Anson Dart was the superintendent of Indian Affairs from Oregon from 1850 to 1852. And he was the first one to negotiate treaties with the Willamette Valley tribes. He was instructed to focus on the Willamette Valley first and to remove the Indians east of the Cascade Mountains, to leave the whole of the land open for settlers. And I wanted to pause a minute and talk about something that Courtney brought up and something that really struck me when I was researching this. Because I had mostly thought of the treaties as contracts around land, around removing natives from one place, putting them in reservations. But something that really struck me was the extent to which the treaties also had this assimilation thrust, both the impetus going into them and then the treaties themselves. So I wanted to just quote to you a little bit from Anson Dart's orders that he received from the Bureau of Indian Affairs in July 20th, 1850. And this reminded me of Andrew Jackson's quote that Courtney shared. Quote, "The rapid increase of our population, its onward march from the Missouri frontier westward and the Pacific east, steadily lessening and closing up the intervening space, renders it certain that there remains to the red man but one alternative: early civilization or gradual extinction." These are in Anson Dart's letters. And as someone who really pays attention to language, it bothered me that the letter said only one alternative and then gave two, right? But I was reflecting on it. Early civilization or gradual extinction are really the same thing. They're really the same thing. And that was absolutely the priority of the US government at the time, was assimilate or die. And that was the context into which these treaty negotiations happened. One other note from Anson Dart's instructions that stood out to me was the use of Christian missionaries to forward the role and the policies of the US government. So I'll quote one more thing from that letter. "The efforts of the government will be earnestly directed to his civilization and preservation, and we confidently rely upon their Christian teachers that, in connection with their spiritual mission, they will aid in carrying out this policy. That stationed as they are among the various Indian tribes, they will use all their influence in restraining their wild, roving, and predatory disposition, and in teaching them the arts and bringing them to the habits of civilized life." So from the very beginning in the Doctrine of Discovery, the church has been playing a very active role in this assimilation and civilization. And in this context, the US government saw them as their strongest ally in moving forward that assimilative agenda, which, I know we know somehow in theory, but seeing that so clearly written in the instructions to the Indian superintendent landed pretty stark and hard for me. So Anson Dart, in that context, went to negotiate with tribes in the Willamette. Now, remember, his orders were to remove them east of the mountains, but Even in their weakness, the tribes were still strong, and the Kalapuya tribes successfully defended their right to remain on their lands. Each treaty that Dart negotiated included a small reservation within their homelands. It's hard to see in this map, but the reservations are all there in the Willamette Valley. And if ratified, the Santiam, the Lucky Mute, the Yamhill, the Tualatin, the Molalla, and the Clackamas people all would have retained some small part of their ancestral lands. This map, drawn in 1851, depicted where the reservations were to be located in the Willamette Valley once Congress ratified the treaties. You're probably saying to yourself, there are no reservations in the Willamette. What happened? What happened to those treaties that people came together and I wouldn't say in good faith, but negotiated to actually retain some of their land? And it's quite a story. None of the treaties. Anson Dart negotiated 18 treaties with Willamette Valley tribes, and none of them were ratified by Congress. And in my past research, I have, come upon several times the popular theory that they weren't ratified because the white settlers in Oregon were horrified with the idea that they might have to commingle with Native people. And so they pressured Congress to not ratify those treaties. That's out there. A lot of different, Oregon Encyclopedia, a lot of different websites have that theory. But I should take a quick moment and drop in the chat if I can. It's very hard while you're presenting to put something in the chat. So I'm just going to tell you, I found this website that if you are interested in going deeper into any of these issues, there is a enrolled member of the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde, who is a sociologist, who has a website that goes deep into the history of Oregon treaties. It's fantastic. It's ndnhistoryresearch.com, and I strongly recommend it. And I was reading through his website, and he had an essay about Anson Dart and the non-ratified treaties. And he had original documents, including a letter from Superintendent Dart that he wrote to Congress, in which he disclosed that there were already white settlers within the reservation boundaries who had land claims that were validated by US laws, and that the alternatives were either to buy them out and ratify the treaties and buy them out, or for Congress to refuse to ratify the treaties. So Anson Dart, in a way, sabotaged his own treaties because, unsurprisingly, Congress chose not to ratify those treaties rather than buying out the white settlers who already had claims under this Doctrine of Discovery and the Donation Land Claims Act in the homeland territory of the treaty tribes. So all that work, those negotiations, the good faith that the tribes show up with, all was for naught. And that, of course, did not land well with the tribes, but their position had been severely weakened because of, the continued influx of settlers who were getting land that was getting, formalized by the U.S. government. And so we began a whole nother era of treaty making in 1853 with new Indian supervisor Joel Palmer, who, from the U.S. government's point of view, had much more success in his treaty negotiations. So this here is a map of the treaties, 7 of which Joel Palmer was instrumental in negotiating. And it shows the huge expanse of land that was covered. There is no part of Oregon that was not Indigenous land. There's no part of Oregon that wasn't ceded by a treaty. And so whenever people think about what is Indigenous land? Am I on stolen land? The answer is yes. It's yes, unless you are on one of the very few scattered and small reservations that we have left in Oregon today. The answer is yes, there was a tribe who used your land. And Joel Palmer was instrumental in giving them away. So he was a military leader, And he came in with both, the personal force and the implied force of the army behind his work. And he succeeded in the US government's goal of removing Native people from the fertile valleys of Western Oregon and the riversides. So already weakened by sickness, threatened by more and more aggressive white settlers, which the stories of which are quite appalling, the tribes very reluctantly agreed to relocate in newly established reservations in exchange for a very small amount of money. If you can believe it, all of Oregon, if you total all of the amounts spent in different purchases, all of Oregon was bought for $1.5 million. Not very much money, but part of Joel Palmer's instructions from the government had to be to spend as little money as possible and make as many promises of goods or services as he can. So the treaties usually had very little money and a lot of promises of goods or services or future goods or services. So there were a lot of treaties, like I said, there were 7, but I want to focus on the one that's nearest to Bark, which is the treaty with Warm Springs, because the Warm Springs Reservation shares a large border with Bark, and I thought that was an important one personally as a Bark staffer to learn more about. So we're going to just dive in a little bit more specifically to the Warm Springs Treaty, to what did these treaties actually have in them? What did they include? So by 1855, when this treaty was negotiated, colonial settlement had been rapidly increasing, right? About 1,000 immigrants crossed the Dalles annually in 1843. By 1847, there are about 4,000 settlers per year. By 1852, up to 12,000 settlers per year were crossing through Warm Springs and Wasco territory. So there's this massive influx of white settlement and this huge land grab that was happening in the context of severely affected tribes who had lost 80 to 90% of their members. It was a very challenging condition, and tribal leaders recognized that they needed a safe haven. So in 1855, Joel Palmer met at the Dalles with representatives of the various Upper Chinookan and Sahaptin peoples from the mid-Columbia River. These groups included the Chinookan Kikst speakers, the Dog River, Dalles, and Keegaltwala tribes of the Wasco. There are people of the river, the Salmon people, and also Sahaptin-speaking Thai, Wyam, Tenino, and Doxboo's bands of the Walla Wallas, now called Warm Springs, who were more people of the seasonal round, did more hunting and gathering and less river dependent. And as a note, 20 years later, Shoshone-speaking Paiute people would be removed to the Warm Spring Reservation from Southeast Oregon, but they were not part of the original 1855 treaty. So in the treaty negotiations, these groups ceded approximately 10 million acres of land south of the Columbia River between the Cascades and the Blue Mountains to the US government, reserving only 578,000 acres of that land for themselves, land that bordered the Deschutes, Warm Springs, and Metolius rivers for their exclusive use. Now, this treaty that Palmer proposed was very advantageous to the US government. They were, was largely removing the Upper Chinookan and Sahaptin people from the river corridor, which was becoming a more and more important east-west corridor for migration, connecting the Pacific Slope and the Western valleys to the inland regions of the Pacific Northwest. The land that the Warm Springs tribes actually reserved to themselves was a remote corner of their territory that they seldom used because it was not rich land, and most of the people didn't even really know what was there aside from the fact that it was not desirable for settlement. And importantly, the treaty also reserved rights outside of the reservation, which is essential, especially for the Chinookan people, the people of the Salmon. They reserved sites for fishing, hunting, and gathering. Of course, there would be a later treaty that would remove those rights, but luckily that treaty is disappeared into the mists of time. We might, when we start talking about broken treaties in the next session, though, I might bring that one up. But it really recognized that even though the tribe was removing to the reservation that in order to have any kind of livelihood, they still needed to have access to their traditional use grounds. This one, though, also really had that assimilationist bend. The treaty included, let's see how to say this, the promise of all the promise of goods and services that they need to adopt a settled white mercantilist agricultural life. It included things like the requirement that the United States would erect at suitable points on the reservation a sawmill and a flouring mill, suitable hospital buildings, a schoolhouse, a blacksmith shop, a tin and a gunsmith shop, a wagon and plowmaker shop, and a dwelling house and requisite outbuilding for each employed in these professions. So there was the aspect of land theft, but there's also the aspect of assimilation, which would stop the tribes from doing their seasonal rounds or living in their traditional villages, which would set them up in the agrarian mercantilist life of the white settlers and basically civilize them so in order to not exterminate them. And also, as you may imagine, the United States did not follow through with all of those promises and did not really offer all of those things to the Native people over time. But I wanted to show you this map before moving on. Let's see. Ooh, we're not going to get to Southern Oregon, are we? I thought we might not, because there's just so much to cover here. So I'll just look at this map, and it shows you that the beige on this map are the use areas of these tribes. The light color are the areas that they ceded in their treaties, and the dark color is the area of the reservation. These are the tribes that make up the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. It just gives you a sense of how much land was inhabited by the tribes, some of whom were more sedentary, some of whom had a huge range that they roamed. How much land was ceded in these really lopsided treaty negotiations, and then how much is left? It's not much. Native Americans currently make up 6% of the US population. And there are reasons for that, the reasons of disease, the reasons of cultural erasure, of assimilation, of land theft, the breaking of the relationship of a people and their land in order to weaken them so that they would abandon their culture, so they would have to abandon their culture and assimilate into white life. And it's heartbreaking. This is hard history to hold. I wanted to go into the Southern Oregon history because it's slightly different. It involves a lot more resistance and some warfare. But unfortunately, we're just gonna we're gonna come back to this on the next session, because I think it's a good way to start with a reminder of this period and how it sets up. Remember how I began when we were waiting. If you weren't here, we were waiting and someone asked for a song. And I sang you a song. I sang you a song that I loved growing up. And I give it to you now with this sense that once you learn this history, and once you really start to bring it into yourself, you are going to see things differently. You have to see things differently. We are taught to not see colonial history. We are taught that it is something that happened, that we are here now, that it is our manifest destiny to be here, that we have a right to this land. And though that's wrong. It was wrong-headed from the Doctrine of Discovery on, and we are the beneficiaries of it, and there are many, many victims. And when you start seeing it, things are going to feel different. They're going to land differently, and they should. So I want to bring us back to the song that I started with. And you've probably sung this, maybe with some degree of pride, some sense like, yes, this is my land. It's a wonderful folk song. But when I look at it through these different eyes, it is a rallying cry for manifest destiny. I'm going to sing it one more time and think about it in that way. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. Or was it? Or did we take it with blood? Did we take it with lies and violence? Were there people here who are still here, but in a severely less privileged position because of the role of our ancestors in our present? I say yes. And that's something we all need to struggle with. And, you know, it's not enough to acknowledge the land. The question is, what do we do now? And so I want to leave you with that question in yourself. What do you do with this information? How do you take this story, make it your own story, and start telling it? Right? Because those treaties, the people in Warm Springs know their treaty, right? But that treaty had two governments, and I am a citizen of the government on the other side, and I didn't read that treaty until 2 weeks ago. You know, I knew it existed, but I never read it because it was my privilege not to read it. And so I'd encourage you all to dig deeper into this information to find out more. Both Courtney and I have extensive resource lists that we've compiled in researching this. And I think we'll be able to send that all out to you, and hopefully with a recording of this as well, because this is the kind of work that once you start digging in, that there's a lot to see and a lot to learn from. And thank you all for being here and being open to hearing this. And I look forward to our continued conversations about it.